14 American boys were dead in the coconut groves. 14 in 72 hours. Not from artillery, not from a banzai charge, one at a time. Shot through the neck, shot through the temple. Shot from banyan trees so tall the shooters looked like shadows against the sun. It was January of 1943. The island was Guadalcanal, and by the fourth day of the killing, the United States Army had run out of answers. So they called for the lieutenant with the toy rifle. He was 27 years old, Illinois, farm country, state champion, marksman, and the weapon he carried into that jungle was not a military rifle at all. It was a civilian hunting rifle, a Winchester Model 70. He had bought it through the mail with 2 years of National Guard paychecks back when the world was still at peace. His own captain called it his mail-order sweetheart. 4 days later, that captain never used those words again. Sit back. Pour yourself something. This is the story of 2nd Lieutenant John Bonnie George and what one man with the right rifle and the right training can do when everything else has failed. This is a story your fathers might have known, and it deserves to be remembered. The morning of January 22nd, 1943, arrived slowly over Guadalcanal. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting leaves, of the sweet decay that jungles produce when the sun has not yet burned the mist off the canopy. Somewhere south of the coconut groves at Point Cruz, artillery muttered like distant thunder. But here, west of the Guadalcanal River, the world had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that is not absence of sound, but presence of attention. The kind of quiet where the jungle itself seems to be holding its breath. At 9:17 in the morning, a young man crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker. The bunker had been shelled 2 weeks earlier. Sandbags lay split open like burst fruit. Splintered timbers pointed at the sky, and through a narrow gap in the broken wall, a rifle rested on a folded canvas pad, its barrel angled toward a banyan tree 240 yards away. The man behind the rifle was 27 years old. Born in 1915, he had grown up in the American Midwest, shooting tin cans off a fence post in country where a boy could walk out the kitchen door with a rifle and be gone until sundown, and nobody worried. That was America before the war. That was the country he was fighting for. 2nd Lieutenant, United States Army, 132nd Infantry Regiment, Americal Division. And now, in a bunker on an island most Americans had never heard of the year before, he was hunting men through a scope his commanding officer had called a toy. The rifle was a Winchester Model 70. Bolt action, 5 rounds, chambered in .30-06. About 9 pounds with the scope mounted, and that scope was a Lyman Alaskan, 2.5 power magnification, held in place by a Griffin and Howe side mount, small, simple, civilian. Every other officer in his battalion carried an M1 Garand, semi-automatic, 8 rounds, standard issue. The Garand was a fine weapon. It had already killed thousands of Japanese soldiers across the Pacific. But the Garand was made for volume of fire. The Winchester was made for one shot at a time, placed exactly where a man intended it to go. George had not brought the Winchester to Guadalcanal to prove a point. He had brought it because he did not trust the alternative. To understand why, you have to go back 4 years. In the summer of 1939, on a rifle range outside Peoria, Illinois, a young man of 23 lay prone on the concrete. He wore a canvas shooting jacket thick as armor. His cheek was pressed against the stock of a target rifle. The target was 1,000 yards away. At that distance, a human figure would look like a fingernail held at arm's length. A bullseye would be invisible to the naked eye. The young man fired, worked the bolt, fired again, worked the bolt, fired again. When the scoring detail called back the results, the range officer paused for a long moment before repeating them into the microphone. The young man had shot the highest score of the match. He had won the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards. His name was John George. And in that moment, he learned something that most soldiers never get to learn. He learned exactly what he was capable of. A year later, he enlisted in the Illinois National Guard. He was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant in 1941. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor that December, George was already in uniform, already trained, already, in his own quiet way, ready. But when he arrived at Camp Forest, Tennessee, in the spring of 1942, something happened that shook him to the core. The men in his platoon could not shoot. They were good men, farm boys from Illinois, factory workers from Chicago, sons of immigrants who had never held a rifle before enlistment. They were brave, they were willing. but they had been given 2 days of rifle training. 15 rounds of ammunition per man. That was all, and then the Army had declared them ready for combat. George stood on the training range one afternoon in Tennessee, watching a private struggle to hit a stationary target at 200 yards. The private missed again, missed a third time. The range officer walked over, made an adjustment to the sights, and told the private to try again. The private hit the target once out of 5 shots. The range officer nodded, marked the private as qualified, and moved into the next man. That night, George sat in his tent with a notebook. He wrote a single sentence in careful pencil. A fine competitive archer, he wrote, would be more effective in combat with his bow and arrow than the average infantry rifleman armed with an M1 rifle. He picked up the field telephone. He called long distance. His mother answered. He asked her to ship him something. A rifle, his rifle. The Winchester Model 70 he had bought with money saved from his National Guard pay. Send it, he told her. And send the scope, and send the mount. Send them wherever the Army sends me next, because I do not intend to go to war with 2 days of training and 15 rounds of ammunition. His mother said she would send them. 6 weeks later, at a supply depot on Guadalcanal, a sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. The men of the 132nd Infantry Regiment had come to Guadalcanal in December of 1942 to relieve the Marines. The Marines had landed in August. They had taken Henderson Field. They had held it through the worst of it, through the Battle of Edson's Ridge, through the naval battles that turned the waters off Savo Island into an underwater graveyard the Americans called Iron Bottom Sound. By December, the Marines were exhausted. They were malaria-riddled. They had done what they came to do. Now it was the Army's turn to finish it. The finishing meant Mount Austin. Mount Austin was not tall, only 1,500 feet. But it stood between the Americans and the western half of Guadalcanal, and the Japanese had turned it into a fortress. The Japanese called it the Gefu after a mountainous province back home. 500 soldiers, 47 bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, camouflage so effective that American patrols walked past the bunkers without seeing them, only to be cut down from behind when they turned back. The 132nd attacked Mount Austin on December 17, 1942. They fought for 16 days. They lost 34 men killed, 279 wounded. They took the western slope on January 2, 1943, and by then the Gefu had passed into the private mythology of every man who survived it. Men would still be dreaming about it in their old age. Men who never talked about the war would still, decades later, wake up sweating with the smell of that mountain in their nostrils. In 16 days of combat, John George had not fired his Winchester once. The mountain had been too close, too dense, too chaotic. Bunkers at 30 feet, grenades at 10. The Winchester was a rifle made for distance and stillness, and Mount Austin had allowed neither. So the crate remained in his footlocker, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting. Captain Morris was George's company commander. Morris was 35, a career officer, competent and blunt. He had seen George's rifle on the first day it came out of the crate. He had looked at the Winchester the way a man looks at a poodle at a wolf hunt. "Leave it in the tent," Morris had said. "Carry the Garand. That is a real weapon." George had carried the Garand up Mount Austin. But when the battalion moved down to the coastal groves at Point Cruz in mid-January, George moved the Winchester into his pack, just in case. Just in case turned out to be sooner than he thought. The Japanese had retreated west from Mount Austin. Some of them had gone all the way back to Cape Esperance, waiting for the destroyers that would come at night to evacuate them off the island. But others had stayed, not to fight a battle, to fight a delay, to buy time, to make the Americans pay for every yard of coconut grove between the Matanacao and the sea. They dug into the massive banyan trees. They climbed the palms. They chose their positions before dawn and stayed in them all day, motionless, drinking sparingly, eating rice from little cotton bags. They carried Arisaka Type 97 sniper rifles, 6.5 millimeter, bolt action, 2.5 power scope, almost identical in principle to the Winchester in John George's hands, except these men had been trained in a Japanese sniper school where marksmanship was considered a form of religious discipline, trained in a doctrine that said, a good sniper does not retreat. A good sniper stays in his tree until he has killed enough Americans to justify his death. The doctrine had a name. Some Americans translated it as die with the tree. On January 19th, 1943, a corporal from L Company knelt at a small creek near Point Cruz to fill his canteens. He was 22. He was from Ohio. He had a girl back home. He never heard the shot. The bullet went through his neck at an angle from above, and by the time his squad mate turned around, he was already dead in the running water. On January 20th, 2 more men died on patrol. Same pattern. Shot from above. Shot from trees that patrols had walked past without noticing. On January 21st, 3 more. One of them was shot through the throat from a banyan tree that his patrol had walked past twice on the same trail. More than a dozen Americans dead in 72 hours. The battalion commander called for John George that night. The commander was a tired man, younger than he looked. He had a lamp on a folding table and a map of the coast groves and a face gone gray with 3 days of dead men. He looked up when George entered the tent and did not stand. He gestured at the map. "There are Japanese snipers in those trees," he said. "My men cannot find them. My men cannot see them. My men are dying to them, and I have no answer." Then he looked at George's rifle, propped against the tent pole. "I hear you can shoot," he said. George said he could. "Prove it," the commander said. "Tomorrow at dawn." George stood, saluted, and walked back through the dark to his tent. He sat down on his cot. He took the Winchester across his lap. He opened the bolt and inspected the chamber. He ran a patch through the barrel. He checked the scope mounts. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 ball ammunition, the same cartridge the Garand fired, into the internal magazine. He worked the bolt slowly, feeding the top round into the chamber. He clicked the safety on. He did not sleep. He sat with the rifle across his knees, and he listened to the jungle breathing outside his tent, and he thought about a range in Illinois in the summer of 1939. He thought about the feel of a target rifle against his cheek. He thought about the moment when a bullseye 1,000 yards away came into focus through iron sights, and the whole world narrowed to a single point of concentration. He thought about the private in Tennessee who could not hit a target at 200 yards. He thought about the young corporal dead in a creek and the 14 others. At 4 a.m, he stood up. He put on his fatigues. He put on his boots. He picked up his rifle and his canteen and 60 rounds of ammunition in 5-round stripper clips. He walked out into the dark. What happened over the next 4 days would go into a book that most Americans have never read. But before George could pull the trigger for the first time, the jungle had one more thing to teach him. Stay with me. The bunker he had chosen was the one his battalion had captured 3 days earlier on the edge of the coconut groves. It was a good position. It overlooked a stand of banyans 200 to 300 yards out. It had cover on 3 sides. It had a narrow firing slit that would hide his muzzle flash from most angles. He settled in as the eastern sky went from black to charcoal to the color of old bone. He rested the Winchester on a folded canvas pad. He raised the scope to his eye. He began to glass the trees. The jungle was already awake. Birds calling, insects rising. Somewhere far off, a machine gun stuttered and fell silent. But the trees in front of him were still, that specific stillness of a jungle at dawn, before the wind picks up and the leaves begin to move. He watched. He watched for 2 hours. At 9:17, one of the leaves moved. Not the way a leaf moves when the wind touches it. Different. A small, deliberate shift, up high in a banyan tree 87 feet above the jungle floor, 240 yards out. George put his eye against the scope, and in the crosshairs, in the fork where 3 branches met, he saw the shape of a man. The man in the tree did not know he was already dead. He was facing east, his back angled toward the trail where American supply parties had been moving up through the coconut groves at first light. He wore dark green, almost black in the shadow of the canopy, a cotton cap, a rifle across his knees. He had climbed into that fork before dawn, and he had waited there, motionless, for hours. He was good at his job. He had killed at least 2 Americans in the last 3 days. He believed he was invisible. He was wrong by 3/4 of a second. John George settled his cheek against the stock of the Winchester. The wood was warm from the tropical morning, worn smooth by 4 years of use. He knew this rifle the way a man knows his own hands. He knew how it kicked. He knew how the trigger broke. He had adjusted that trigger himself at Camp Perry, Ohio, before the war, when the biggest problem in his life had been a bad shooting week at the national matches. He controlled his breathing. 2 clicks, right for wind. The scope's magnification pulled the man in the tree closer, made him solid, made him real. 240 yards became something manageable, something that could be reached with a bullet. The Winchester's trigger broke clean. George squeezed. The rifle kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the coconut grove and echoed back off the trees. And 240 yards away, the man in the banyan jerked once and slid sideways off his perch. He fell through the branches like a broken doll, catching once on the way down, then continuing. He hit the jungle floor in a small explosion of leaves and dust. George worked the bolt. The empty brass ejected and spun into the sandbag beside him. He chambered a fresh round. He kept the scope on the tree. He waited. The jungle did not react. This was the first lesson. Death in war is not always loud. Sometimes it takes the jungle a long minute to understand that something has changed inside it. And in that minute, if you know what you are doing, you can kill again. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. One shooter, one spotter. The spotter would be somewhere close in the same tree or the next one over, and he would have heard the shot and seen his partner fall. At 9:43, George saw movement in a tree 60 yards north of the first, lower this time, about 50 feet up, and the movement was downward, a dark shape sliding along the trunk of a banyan, one careful hand at a time, trying to reach the ground. He had heard the shot. He knew his partner was gone. He was trying to get out of the trees before the American with the invisible rifle could find him. He was too late by 20 seconds. George led the movement the way he would lead a running deer in a Midwestern cornfield in October. He put the crosshairs a half a body ahead of the descending shape. He squeezed the trigger. The second man fell backwards off the trunk. His rifle came down separately, clattering through the branches ahead of him, and both of them, man and weapon, hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 men. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. There was no exultation in him. There was no triumph. There was only the small, cold satisfaction of a job done correctly. Now, if you served, you understand what happened next. You understand the way silence changes after you have done something that cannot be taken back. You understand the way your hands go steady while your heart goes somewhere else. If you did not serve, but your father did, or your uncle, or your older brother, this is the part they never talked about at the Thanksgiving table. This is what they were carrying when they came home and would not say why they woke up at 3 in the morning for the rest of their lives. George would remember those young faces for the rest of his life. He did not celebrate what he had done. He never did. In his private ledger, kept in a language he shared with no one, he understood that killing a man, even in war, even a man who would have killed him first, is a weight you carry until the ground takes it from you. At 11:21, a rifle cracked to the southwest and a bullet struck the sandbags 6 inches from John George's head. The impact sprayed grit and torn burlap into his face. Something stung his cheek. He rolled left fast and pressed himself flat against the inside of the bunker wall. His heart hammered against the stock of the Winchester, and for a moment, the calm that had carried him through 2 clean shots dissolved into pure animal fear. He lay there and breathed. He counted. At 60, he made himself move. He crawled to a different part of the firing slit. He raised the scope slowly, using the shadow of a broken timber to hide his lens from the sun. He glassed the southwestern trees. The third shooter had made his decision. He would have moved after taking his shot. That was doctrine. Fire once, relocate, fire again from somewhere else. But this jungle was dense. This grove had only so many trees tall enough for a sniper's platform. Relocation was not really an option here. It was more of a suggestion. At 11:38, George found him. 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans. 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned. All right, he had moved to a different branch. But he had stayed in the same tree. It was a mistake. George put the crosshairs on the shape and fired. The 3rd sniper fell without making a sound. The jungle did not react this time either. It had begun to learn. By noon, John George had killed 5 men. Word traveled back through the battalion the way word does when men have been dying and suddenly stop. Riflemen came up from the rear areas, asking to watch the lieutenant work. A young corporal offered to bring him coffee. A sergeant from another platoon wanted to know if he could just stand behind the bunker and observe. George sent all of them away. Spectators, he said. Draw attention. Attention draws fire. He was polite about it, but he did not let them stay. Because the thing he understood, even at his age, was that his advantage was not the rifle. His advantage was that the enemy did not know where he was, and every man who came near his bunker was a small, unintended flag waving in the trees, telling the surviving Japanese exactly where to look. That afternoon he saw nothing. The remaining snipers had adjusted. They stopped moving in daylight. They understood now that a shooter with a scope was hunting them, and that mistakes had become expensive. The jungle went quiet again. At 1600 hours, George walked back to battalion headquarters through the coconut groves. He passed the bodies of the first 2 men he had killed. Someone had rolled them onto their backs. Their faces were young, younger than he had expected. One of them looked no more than 18. He did not stop to look. He kept walking. Captain Morris was waiting for him at battalion. The mockery was gone from Morris's voice. He asked George one question. "Can you do that again tomorrow?" George said he could. Morris nodded, just once. That night, George cleaned his rifle. He ran patches through the barrel until they came out white. He wiped down the scope. He loaded 5 fresh rounds. Then he lay on his cot in the dark, and he tried not to see the faces from the coconut grove, and he waited for morning. The morning came in the form of rain. Tropical rain, the kind that fell in sheets so thick you could barely see the tent next to yours. By the time George reached his bunker at 5 in the morning, the jungle floor was mud and visibility was less than 100 yards, and the whole world had gone gray and silver and hissing. He waited. At 8:15, the rain slowed. By 8:45, he could see the trees again. He raised the scope. At 9:12, he found number 6. The Japanese sniper had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The sound of the downpour would have masked his movement. He had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday, also smart. They were learning what George could do, and they were trying to reach out beyond his reliable range. George compensated. He adjusted the elevation. He held for the extra distance. The sniper fell, but this one had friends of a different kind. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began falling around John George's bunker. They had triangulated him. From muzzle flash, or from sound, or from both, they had put ears and eyes on the coconut grove and worked out the arc, and now they were dropping 81mm shells into the general area of his firing position. The first salvo landed 40 yards short, close enough to feel the ground shake through the sandbags. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third salvo was going to hit the bunker. John George did not stay to confirm it. He grabbed his rifle and his ammunition and he ran. He sprinted north along the tree line, boots slipping in mud, and he dove into a shell crater as the third salvo came down behind him. The bunker where he had made his morning stand disappeared in a bloom of smoke and dirt and splintered timber. Sandbags that had held for 6 weeks vanished in 3 seconds. George lay in the crater with his face pressed into wet earth and listened to the debris rain down around him. Then he got up, and he found a new position. A fallen tree, 120 yards north of what used to be his bunker. Not as much cover, but a good view of the groves. He settled in behind the trunk. He raised the scope. He resumed his watch. At 14:23, he killed number 7. At 15:41, he killed number 8. That one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan. Excellent concealment, but at that height, when the sun angle changed in the afternoon, the sniper's silhouette had briefly appeared against the sky through a gap in the leaves. 2 seconds of exposure. It was enough. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner. George had been in position for 9. He was to come back to headquarters and report, he reported. 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris asked how many were left. Intelligence estimated 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves before George started. 8 now dead, 3 still out there, 3 left, and those 3, both men understood, would be the best of the group. The ones who had survived because they were the most careful, the most difficult to find. Morris told George to sleep. George did not sleep. He sat in his tent at 3 in the morning with the Winchester across his lap and did the arithmetic in his head. 3 snipers, 12 hours of daylight, his scope against theirs, their knowledge now of what he looked like and what he carried and roughly where he liked to work from. They were hunting him back. That was the change. That was what the third day would be. Not target shooting, not a match at Camp Perry. A duel between men who had each killed and each intended to keep killing. He watched the light come up gray and green through the tent flap. At 4:30 in the morning of January 24th, he stood put on his boots, and walked out into the coconut groves. He did not go back to the fallen tree. He did not go back to any place he had used before. He walked 70 yards south to a cluster of large rocks that the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position was old, overgrown. Vines had crept up between the boulders. The Japanese would not expect him there. He settled in with the Winchester against a rock. He waited. The rain began again at 4:15. It slowed to a drizzle at 7:43. Visibility crept back up. George raised the scope and began to glass the trees. At 8:17, he found what looked like sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was in a palm tree, 190 yards out, only 40 feet up. That was low. That was unusually low. Most snipers climbed high for sight lines, and this one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds around him made a kind of natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But John George was not at ground level. He was on the rocks, elevated. From his angle, he could see the shape of the man's shoulders through the fronds. He could see the dark curve of a cap. He put the crosshairs on the shape. He controlled his breathing. He began to squeeze the trigger, and then he stopped, because something was wrong. He had killed 8 men in 2 days. He had spent 9 hours a day watching Japanese snipers hide themselves in trees. He knew by now what a careful sniper looked like, and what a careless one looked like. The position in the palm tree was too easy. The remaining 3 snipers were the survivors, the best. They would not make elementary mistakes. They would not put themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them from 600 feet away. Not on the 3rd day, not after 8 of their comrades had died. Unless the point was to be spotted, John George lowered his rifle. He kept the scope up. He kept it moving. He began to search the surrounding trees, not the palm, the trees near the palm. Because if the man in the palm was bait, then somewhere out there, in a position of perfect concealment, another man was watching that palm and waiting to see who would take the shot. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, John George found him. A banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm. 91 feet up. Vines and branches concealed the sniper from 3 sides, but not from George's angle. From George's angle, he was visible. A dark shape in a perfect hide, rifle steadied, eye against a scope, waiting. He was watching George's old position at the fallen tree. He did not know John George had moved. He was waiting for a muzzle flash in the wrong place. For a long moment, John George just watched him, and in that moment, he understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He understood that the men he was hunting were not caricatures. They were not the yellow devils of the propaganda posters. They were craftsmen. They had trained for years. They had built their trap with intelligence and discipline. They had thought about him the way he had thought about them, and they were still going to lose, because they were still, in the end, waiting for the wrong thing. George had a choice to make. If he shot the man in the palm first, the man in the banyan would locate his real position by sound. If he shot the man in the banyan first, the man in the palm might see him. He decided to use the bait against the trap. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree. He adjusted for wind. He squeezed the trigger. The decoy fell, and in the instant his body dropped through the fronds, John George swung the Winchester 90 degrees to the left, worked the bolt in one motion, and put the crosshairs on the banyan tree. The real sniper had heard the shot. He was turning, swinging his rifle toward the sound. He knew, in that terrible fraction of a second, that he had been outguessed. George fired. The real sniper fell. 2 shots, 2 men, 10 kills. But John George had revealed his position, and he knew it. He grabbed the rifle and his ammunition, and he ran east along the rock line, and he dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away and pressed himself into the mud. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been 6 seconds before. The bullets kicked up stone chips and dust. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before he moved again. Then he crawled east and dropped into a shell crater 100 yards on, this one half full of rainwater from the morning storm. He settled into the crater with water up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the rim. He glassed the trees. 10 Japanese snipers, dead, 1 left, and the 11th had done something the other 10 had not. He had come down from the trees. He was on the ground, and he was crawling toward John George's position. What happens in the next 12 minutes will decide everything. He saw the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground. A shape moving through the undergrowth, parallel to the tree line, careful as a snake through wet grass. The 11th sniper had abandoned the trees. He had watched 10 men climb into banyans and die there, and he had drawn the only conclusion a survivor could draw. The trees were a coffin now. The trees belonged to the American with the scoped rifle, so he had come down. He had put himself in the ferns and the vines and the fallen branches, and he was crawling the ground the way a hunter crawls toward a stag at the last 100 yards of a long stalk. He was crawling toward John George. George did not move. The Winchester was already shouldered. Water lapped against his ribs. His breathing was slow and shallow. Every instinct in him wanted to rise, wanted to bring the scope to bear, wanted to end this the way he had ended the 10 before. But the crater rim was too high for the angle he needed. To take the shot, he would have to lift his head above the lip of the crater. And lifting his head at this moment, in this fight, might be the last thing he ever did. So he waited. The Japanese sniper stopped at 9:52. He had reached a position about 40 yards from the machine gun rocks where George had made his morning stand. He was studying the boulders through his own scope, searching for movement, searching for a target that was not there. George could see him now in his peripheral vision. Not clearly, not the man's face, just the shape of him. Low, motionless, deadly still. For 6 long minutes, neither of them moved. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began crawling again, forward, toward the rocks, 35 yards, 30, 25. He was working his way along the most likely path an evacuating American would have taken. He had reconstructed George's movements the way George had reconstructed his. He was hunting his hunter. At 10:03, the 11th sniper reached the rocks. He crawled up into the old machine gun position, settled his rifle across a boulder, and turned his scope to the east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the place a fleeing man would have gone. He was now 38 yards from John George. His back was facing the crater. He did not know George was there. 38 yards. An easy shot, even without the scope. Center of the back. One trigger pull, and it would... 10 days of hunting in the Point Cruz groves. Over. 11 Japanese snipers dead. The mission complete. John George kept his crosshairs on the man in the rocks, and he did not fire, because something was wrong. The position in the rocks was too exposed. No experienced would remain there for more than a few seconds without cover. This was the survivor, the best of them. He would not sit in the open like this unless there was a reason. Unless he was bait, too. John George kept the scope on the man in the rocks, but let his awareness widen. If this was another decoy, the real killer would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with a clean line of sight to anyone who fired on the man in the machine gun nest. At 10:06, George found the second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk, motionless, rifle aimed at the drainage ditch where any Marksman shooter was expected to be. The 11th sniper brought a partner, 2 men, 1 American, a bolt-action rifle that fired 1 round at a time and required a hand on the bolt between shots. The mathematics were bad. If George fired at the man in the rocks, the man behind the log would kill him before he could chamber a second round. If George fired at the man behind the log, the man in the rocks would kill him instead. He could not shoot both of them fast enough. He could not shoot either of them and survive. He lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed at the sky, barrel dry. The water was cold. The mud on the bottom of the crater sucked at his boots. Insects landed on his forehead and crawled across his skin, and he did not brush them away. He waited. At 10:13, the man in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He had concluded that George had run farther east. He signaled to his partner behind the log. Both men began to move. They were going to sweep east 70 yards apart, hunting for the American who had killed 10 of their brothers. They walked past John George's crater. They did not look down. There is a moment in every hunt when the hunter and the hunted change places, when the animal that thought it was the predator realizes, too late, that it has been the prey all along. That moment came to the 2 Japanese soldiers as they passed the water-filled crater with their backs turned. John George rose from the water slowly, silently. Water streamed off his uniform, off his face, off the wooden stock of the Winchester. He brought the rifle to his shoulder. He aimed at the closer man, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. He fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt. Water dripped from his sleeve onto the receiver. He swung the rifle toward the second man, who was already raising his rifle in the direction of the shot. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 Japanese snipers. 11 shots that mattered. 4 days. For a long moment, John George stood in the crater with the water still draining from his clothes, and the jungle went perfectly quiet around him. Not the anticipatory quiet of the morning. A different quiet. A finished quiet. Then he heard voices, Japanese voices, coming from the tree line to the west. Multiple men, a patrol, moving toward the 2 men he had just killed. John George dropped back into the crater. The water closed over him, up to his chin, and he lowered himself further until only his eyes remained above the muddy surface. He held the Winchester vertically, barrel to the sky. He listened. Several men, boots pushing through wet undergrowth, equipment rattling, voices calling to one another with the sharp, urgent tone of soldiers who have just found their dead. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, then moved to the second. Then at 10:28 they began moving again, not away from the crater, toward it. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. He had been careful about sound and about movement. He had not been careful about tracks. There were 5 rounds in the Winchester and no time to reload. The bad mathematics again, only worse. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25, 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down. His eyes met John George's eyes. There was one instant of pure mutual understanding. The soldier saw an American in the water, rifle already coming up. The American saw a young Japanese face, mouth opening to shout a warning that would never leave his throat. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backwards, out of sight. George worked the bolt while still half submerged, rose to a crouch, and swung the rifle just as 2 more soldiers appeared at the crater edge. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both of them trounced left. He could hear shouting now. More soldiers, closer, someone screaming orders, someone screaming in pain. John George climbed out of the crater on the far side, kept low, and ran 20 yards to a fallen tree. He dropped behind it. Bullets began to crack through the jungle around him, striking bark, striking mud, striking nothing. He glassed the ground through his scope. One more soldier was advancing on the crater, 50 yards out. George shot him. 1 round left. Somewhere behind him, the Japanese were flanking, working around him from 2 directions. John George made the only decision left. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against a squad of infantry with semi-automatic weapons. His job here was done. His job now was to live. He turned and ran north. He ran through the jungle undergrowth with vines catching at his boots and branches whipping his face and Japanese rifle fire cracking past his shoulders. He ran for 1.5 minutes without stopping. Then he dove into another shell crater, this one dry, and lay against the wall gasping. The voices behind him grew fainter. The Japanese did not pursue. They had their dead to recover, and they had lost their taste for chasing a man who had just outfought them. At 10:47, John George began moving again, not running now, walking, slow, careful, staying low, using the terrain. He worked his way northeast toward the American perimeter. The Winchester in his hands was wet, mud on the stock, 1 round in the magazine. At 11:13, an American sentry challenged him from a foxhole on the perimeter. George identified himself. The sentry lowered his rifle and waved him through. John George walked back to battalion headquarters. He did not run. He did not hurry. He walked the way a man walks when he has just come back from a place he never expected to leave. Captain Morris was waiting. George gave the report in the flat, quiet voice of a man giving a report. 11 Japanese snipers dead. Additional kills in a firefight with a recovery patrol, exact count uncertain. Down to 1 round in the magazine. Morris listened. When George finished, Morris did not say anything for a long time. He looked at the Winchester in George's hands. He looked at the mud on George's uniform. He looked at the young man's face and did not find what he expected to find there. There was no triumph in it. There was no satisfaction. There was only the enormous tiredness of a man who had done what needed doing and would now like very much to sit down. "Clean your rifle," Morris said. "Sleep." 2 days later, John George was summoned to regimental headquarters. Colonel Ferry was waiting. Ferry was the regimental commander, a career officer in his mid-40s, a man who had been watching the Point Cruz situation with growing anger for weeks. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would take time. It would require rifles with optics. It would require men who could already shoot. Ferry said he had Springfield 1903 rifles, Marine leftovers, fitted with unertl scopes. He said he had qualified marksmen in the regiment who had never been asked to use those skills. Ferry wanted a sniper section. He wanted George to build it. John George accepted with one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved. The training began at the end of January. A makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field, cleared out of jungle with machetes. Men in ranks, rifles across shoulders, sun pounding down on the coral dust. George started with the fundamentals: breathing, trigger squeeze, reading wind. He worked them in pairs, shooter and spotter. He taught them that the rifle was only the instrument. What killed a man from 400 yards, he told them, was not the bullet. What killed a man was the mind of the shooter. He taught them what a decoy looked like. He taught them what a good hide looked like from the outside. He taught them the mistakes he had seen Japanese snipers make in the Point Cruz groves, and the mistakes he had almost made himself. The Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal on February 9, 1943. American forces reached Cape Esperance and found the beaches empty. The campaign was officially over. The sniper section John George built kept working through the last weeks of the fighting. How many men they killed, no one ever wrote down with certainty. George did not keep score. He would say, decades later, that scoring was not the point. The point was that American soldiers stopped dying in trees and started living to write letters home. You may have grown up seeing the John Wayne pictures. The sands of Iwo Jima, back to Bataan. Those pictures told one version of the Pacific War. Loud, heroic, cinematic. This was not that war. This was the war John George saw. Quiet, careful, fought with a scope and a heartbeat and the willingness to lie still in muddy water for hours until the moment came. In the spring of 1944, John George volunteered for a new mission. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. Officially, they were the 5,307th Composite Unit, provisional, roughly 3,000 men trained for long-range penetration behind Japanese lines in Burma. Their commander was Brigadier General Frank Merrill, 40 years old, half-blind without his glasses, calm as a chapel in a storm. Their mission was to march through hundreds of miles of the worst terrain on Earth and seize the Japanese-held airfield at Myitkyina, which the Allies needed to open a supply route into China. John George went with his Winchester. He modified the rifle for the march. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan scope with a Weaver 330, a simpler scope more suited for the punishing march ahead. He carried the rifle over mountain passes at high altitude. He carried it through leech-infested rivers. He carried it through jungle so thick that a man could stand 3 feet from you and be invisible. The rifle was fired only a handful of times in Burma. Once at over 400 yards at a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at nearly 400 yards at a machine gun position that had pinned down a patrol. Once at just under 300 yards at a Japanese sniper who was in the process of killing a Marauder scout. 3 shots, 3 men, and a great many miles walked between them. The Marauders seized Myitkyina Airfield on May 17, 1944. The town itself would fall in August after another 80 days of siege. But by then, the unit that had entered Burma with 3,000 men had fewer than 200 of the original force still fit to fight. The rest were dead or dying or hospitalized with malaria and dysentery and scrub typhus and the kind of exhaustion that does not go away in one lifetime. John George survived Burma. He was thin. He was yellow with jaundice. But he survived, and his Winchester survived with him. He was evacuated in the summer of 1944. He never fired the rifle in combat again. He came home to America in a country that had already begun to celebrate a victory it had not yet won. He was promoted, he was awarded medals, he was discharged from the Army in 1947, a lieutenant colonel at the end. He went to Princeton on the GI Bill and graduated with highest honors. He studied at Oxford for 4 years. He spent 4 more years in British East Africa studying institutions and governance. He settled in Washington, took a job at the State Department, wrote and lectured on African affairs for the rest of his working life. He did not talk about Guadalcanal. He did not talk about Point Cruz. He did not talk about the men in the banyan trees. But in 1947, in a rented room, he sat down at a typewriter and began to record what he had seen. Not for glory, not for money, for the record. Because the men who had died in his private estimation, largely because the United States Army had failed to teach its infantrymen how to shoot. He wanted the failures he had witnessed at Camp Forest never to happen again. He wanted the next generation of American soldiers to be trained better than his had been. The book was called Shots Fired in Anger. It was first published in 1947. The National Rifle Association reprinted it in an expanded edition in 1981 with an added section on Burma. It is still in print today. Old men in shooting clubs across America still pass it hand to hand. It has never been a bestseller. It has never been made into a movie. But among the small brotherhood of men who understand rifles the way John George understood them, it is scripture. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that he had ordered through the mail in the fall of 1941, that his mother had shipped across the country in a wooden crate, that had traveled with him from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma and home again, was donated to a firearms museum in Virginia. It sits in a display case now, behind glass, under quiet lights. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks from a few feet away like any other vintage sporting rifle. Walnut stock, bolt handle, a small scope. You have to lean in close to read the placard. The placard tells you it belonged to a man named John Bonnie George. It tells you he carried it in the Pacific in the Second World War. It does not tell you about the banyan trees. It does not tell you about the water-filled crater. It does not tell you about the 11 Japanese soldiers who died believing they could not be seen. That story is in the book he wrote, and now it is in your ears. John George did not write his book like a hero. He wrote it like an observer. Because what he had seen in the jungle at Point Cruz was not glory. It was adaptation. Two systems of warfare learning each other in real time. One built on doctrine, one built on survival. And in the small, quiet space between them, one young man with a rifle his commanding officer had called a toy had changed the balance of a battlefield. Not because he was stronger, not because he was braver, but because he had been alone long enough and still enough to see clearly what needed to be done. And when it needed to be done, he did it. Every American man who has ever put on a uniform, from Guadalcanal to Korea to Vietnam to the sands of Iraq, is walking in the footprints John George left in the mud at Point Cruz. If you are one of them, thank you. And if you know one, tell him tonight. Tell him before the phone call cannot be made. If you are watching this and you had a father or an uncle or a brother who came home from the Pacific, or who did not come home, take a moment right now, just a moment. Say his name out loud, because names are the last thing to disappear. Long after the medals turn green, long after the photographs fade, the name is what lasts. If you speak it, he is still here. John Bonnie George. Say it once, for a man who spent 4 days in a jungle so that more American boys would not die in the trees. Rest easy, Colonel. Somebody is still telling the story.